Have you ever walked out of your house and realized you forgot your keys, or perhaps you left your wallet on the kitchen counter after heading to the grocery store? These are mundane annoyances that ruin a morning, but rarely ruin a life. However, in the high-stakes world of criminal enterprise, a simple lapse in memory or a moment of clumsiness can have consequences that are far more severe than a wasted trip home. Imagine committing a felony with adrenaline coursing through your veins, only to leave behind the one object that definitively identifies exactly who you are. This is the story of a heist that should have been a cold case, but turned into an open and shut conviction due to a single gravity-defying error. The year was 1984, and the setting was the bitter wind-swept streets of Chicago, Illinois. The city was in the grip of a harsh winter, and the economic climate was equally unforgiving for the working class. Factories that had once been the beating heart of the Midwest were shuttering, leaving thousands without steady income. The skyline was dominated by the imposing silhouette of the Sears Tower, which stood as a monument to corporate power, casting a long shadow over the struggling neighborhoods below. It was a time of grit and survival, where desperate men often turned to desperate measures to keep the heat on and food on the table. In the midst of this urban struggle lived a man named Elias Thorne. Elias was not a career criminal, nor was he a mastermind of the underworld. He was a 32-year-old former assembly line worker who had been laid off from a manufacturing plant 6 months prior. With bills piling up and an eviction notice taped to his peeling front door, Elias felt the walls closing in on him. The pressure of poverty can distort reality, making irrational ideas seem like the only logical solution. Elias spent his days wandering the freezing streets of the Loop, staring into the warm, well-lit windows of businesses that seemed to exist in a different universe from his own. Elias Thorne was a man who blended into the background. He was of average height, with a gaunt face that wore the permanent exhaustion of the unemployed. He had no record of violence, and his only run-ins with the law were for minor traffic violations. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet guy down on his luck. But inside his mind, a plan was forming. It was a plan born not of malice, but of sheer panic. He decided that he would rob a bank. He told himself it would be a one-time event, a necessary evil to reset his life and get back on his feet. The target he selected was a small branch of the First National Bank of Chicago, located on a busy corner near Wabash Avenue. He chose it because it seemed less imposing than the massive financial fortresses on LaSalle Street. Elias spent weeks watching the location from a coffee shop across the street. He noted the shift changes of the security guards and the flow of customers. He convinced himself that he had accounted for every variable. He studied the timing of the traffic lights and the frequency of police patrols. In his mind, he was being meticulous, but in reality, he was an amateur playing a dangerous game. On the morning of January 12, 1984, Elias woke up before dawn. The temperature outside was well below freezing, and the windows of his small apartment were frosted over. He dressed in layers to combat the cold and to bulk up his thin frame. He put on a thick flannel shirt and a pair of dark corduroy trousers. Over this, he threw on a heavy gray wool coat that had seen better days. He paced around his living room, checking his pockets. He had a handwritten note demanding money and a toy pistol he had painted black to look real. The nerves were already setting in. His hands shook as he drank a cup of stale coffee. He looked at himself in the cracked bathroom mirror and tried to steel his resolve. He told himself that nobody would get hurt. He would just walk in hand over the note, get the cash, and walk out. It sounded so simple in his head. He checked his pockets one last time, patting his coat to ensure the note and the fake gun were there. In his anxiety, he he failed to realize that he had also instinctively grabbed his personal leather wallet and shoved it into the loose side pocket of his coat. Elias left his apartment and walked to the train station. The wind cut through his layers, stinging his face. He pulled a knit cap low over his ears and wrapped a scarf around his neck. The train ride to the loop was a blur of noise and motion. He sat in the corner of the car, avoiding eye contact with other passengers. Every siren he heard in the distance made his heart skip a beat. He felt like everyone could see his intent written on his forehead. The train clattered over the tracks, carrying him closer to the point of no return. When he arrived downtown, the streets were bustling with the morning commute. Businessmen in trench coats hurried past clutching briefcases, while steam rose from the subway grates. Elias merged with the crowd, moving towards the bank. He stopped a block away to catch his breath. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He waited for a break in the pedestrian traffic before approaching the revolving doors of the bank. He took a deep breath, pulled his scarf up to cover his nose and mouth, and stepped inside. The interior of the bank was warm and smelled of floor wax and old paper. The high ceilings and marble floors amplified the sound of footsteps. There were only a few customers in line. Elias kept his head down and joined the queue. He tried to appear casual, but his body was rigid with tension. He rehearsed the words he would say over and over in his mind. He watched the teller at the far end, a middle-aged woman with glasses who looked like she had seen it all. She would be the one. As the line moved forward, Elias felt a surge of adrenaline that made him dizzy. He reached into his coat pocket and gripped the handle of the painted toy gun. It felt cold and foreign in his hand. When it was finally his turn, he stepped up to the counter. The teller looked up at him with a polite but bored expression. Elias tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He cleared his throat and handed her the crumpled note. The note read simply, "Put the money in the bag. No sudden moves." The teller read the note, and her eyes widened slightly. She looked up at Elias and then down at his hand, which was still inside his coat pocket, simulating the shape of a weapon. She did not panic or scream. She was a professional who had been trained for this exact scenario. Slowly and methodically, she began to open her drawer. She reached for the stacks of bills. Elias watched her, every move, his eyes darting around the lobby to see if anyone else had noticed what was happening. "Hurry up," Elias whispered, his voice harsh and strained. He pulled a brown paper grocery bag from his other pocket and shoved it across the marble counter. The teller began placing bundles of cash into the bag. To Elias, the process seemed to take hours. He felt beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cold he had brought in from outside. He leaned over the counter, urging her to move faster. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, driven by a cocktail of fear and adrenaline. It was in this moment of chaotic urgency that the disaster occurred. As Elias leaned far over the counter to grab the bag of money, his heavy wool coat bunched up around his waist. The loose side pocket, where he had stashed his wallet earlier that morning, swung open. Unnoticed by Elias, the brown leather wallet slipped out of the pocket. It fell silently onto the plush carpet on the customer side of the counter, landing directly at his feet. In his frantic state, he did not hear it land, nor did he feel the change in weight. Elias grabbed the bag of money, which felt incredibly light for something that was supposed to save his life. He turned abruptly, knocking into the velvet rope that guided the line. He mumbled an apology to no one in particular and walked briskly towards the exit. He did not run. He knew that running would attract attention. He forced himself to walk at a normal pace, even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to sprint. He pushed through the revolving doors and burst back out into the cold Chicago air. Once outside, Elias turned a corner and broke into a jog. He navigated the alleyways, trying to put distance between himself and the bank. He could hear sirens starting to wail in the distance, but he assumed they were far away. He made his way to a different train station than the one he had arrived at. He boarded a southbound train and collapsed into a seat, clutching the paper bag to his chest. He was shaking uncontrollably. He had done it. He had actually robbed a bank. Back at the First National Bank, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The teller had pressed the silent alarm the moment Elias turned his back. The bank manager locked the doors and asked everyone to remain calm. Within minutes, police cruisers screeched to a halt outside. Officers with drawn weapons entered the building expecting a hostage situation or a shootout. Instead, they found a quiet lobby and a shaken staff. The robber was long gone. Detective Thomas Miller of the Chicago Police Department was one of the first investigators on the scene. Miller was a veteran of the force, a man who wore a fedora and a trench coat not for style, but because they were practical for the weather. He began interviewing the teller, who described the suspect as a nervous white male in a gray coat. It was a generic description that could have matched half the men in the city. Miller sighed, knowing that without a clear face on the security cameras, this would be a tough case to crack. As Miller walked the path the robber had taken, he scanned the floor for evidence. Criminals often drop things in their haste: notes, weapons, or sometimes even the money itself. Miller looked down at the carpet near the teller's window. There, lying innocuously against the base of the counter, was a brown leather wallet. Miller put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully picked it up. He assumed it belonged to a customer who had fled in panic. Miller opened the wallet, hoping to find an identification card so he could return it to its owner. Inside, he found a few dollars in cash, a library card, and an Illinois driver's license. The face on the license was a gaunt young man with dark hair. The name read Elias Thorne. Miller looked at the teller and held up the license. "Is this the man who robbed you?" he asked. The teller squinted at the small photo. She nodded slowly. "Yes, that looks exactly like him," she said. Miller couldn't believe his luck. It was the kind of break that detectives dream about but rarely get. The suspect had literally handed over his name and address to the police. Miller radioed the dispatch center. "We have a suspect identified as Elias Thorne," he said, his voice calm but tinged with amusement. "I have a current address on the license. Send a unit to the residence immediately." The hunt for the phantom robber had turned into a simple pickup order. The mystery was solved before the paperwork had even begun. Meanwhile, Elias had made it back to his apartment. He locked the door and pulled the shades down. He dumped the contents of the paper bag onto his kitchen table. There was about $4,000 in cash. It was enough to pay his back rent and buy him some time. He laughed, a manic sound that echoed in the empty room. He began to strip off his layers of clothing, feeling the sweat cooling on his skin. He reached into his coat pocket to put his wallet on the table. His hand met only empty fabric. Elias froze. He patted the pocket again, harder this time. Nothing. He checked the other pockets. He checked his pants. He checked the floor. A cold pit opened in his stomach. He frantically tore through the pile of clothes he had just taken off. The wallet was nowhere. He tried to retrace his steps in his mind. The train, the walk, the bank. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had dropped it. Elias sat down heavily on one of his kitchen chairs. The money on the table no longer looked like salvation. It looked like evidence. He stared at the wall, his mind racing. His driver's license was in that wallet. His social security card was in there. His library card. They knew who he was. They knew where he lived. The silence of the apartment was suddenly deafening. He expected the door to be kicked in at any second. He had to move. He had to run. He grabbed a duffel bag and started throwing random items into it. Socks, underwear, a toothbrush. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he couldn't stay there. He stuffed the stolen cash into the bag, along with the few clothes he had. He didn't even take the time to put his heavy coat back on, opting for a lighter jacket to move faster. He unlocked his back door, which led to a rickety wooden fire escape. He climbed down into the alley, slipping on the ice. Minutes after Elias fled into the alley, two unmarked police cars pulled up to the front of his building. Officers in tactical gear surrounded the perimeter. Detective Miller went to the front door and knocked loudly. "Police, open up," he shouted. There was no answer. After a second warning, the officers breached the door with a battering ram. They swept the apartment, guns drawn. The apartment was empty, but the signs of a hasty departure were everywhere. Miller walked into the kitchen. He saw the empty paper bag on the table and the clothes scattered on the floor. He touched the coffee pot on the stove. It was still warm. "We just missed him," Miller said into his radio. "Suspect is on the run. Put out an APB for Elias Thorne. He is likely traveling on foot or public transit." Miller knew that a desperate amateur like Thorne wouldn't get far. He didn't have the connections or the resources to disappear. Elias was running through the back streets of his neighborhood, heading towards the Greyhound bus station. He figured he could buy a ticket to anywhere, get out of the state, and start over. He kept his head down, avoiding main roads. The city felt like a trap now. Every police siren sounded like it was coming for him. He was cold, tired, and terrified. The reality of his situation was setting in. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a guy who made a terrible mistake. He reached the bus station, which was crowded with travelers. He got in line for the ticket counter, constantly looking over his shoulder. He saw two uniformed officers walking through the terminal, scanning faces. Elias tried to shrink into his jacket. He stepped out of line and moved towards the bathroom, hoping to hide until they passed. But his nervous behavior attracted attention. One of the officers made eye contact with him. The officer tapped his partner on the shoulder and pointed at Elias. They began to walk towards him. Elias saw them coming. For a split second, he considered running, but he knew it was futile. He was exhausted. He had no weapon. He had no plan. He simply stopped walking and raised his hands in the air. The officers approached him cautiously. "Elias Thorne?" one of them asked. Elias nodded his head, defeated. "Yeah, that is me," he whispered. The arrest was peaceful. The officers handcuffed him and read him his rights in the middle of the busy station. People stopped to watch, staring at the man who looked more like a lost tourist than a bank robber. They searched his duffel bag and found the stacks of cash still bound in the bank wrappers. It was an open and shut case. Elias was placed in the back of a squad car and driven to the precinct, where Detective Miller was waiting for him. In the interrogation room, Elias sat slumped in a metal chair. He looked small and fragile. Miller placed the brown leather wallet on the table between them. Elias stared at it as if it were a cursed object. "I believe you dropped this, Miller," said his voice, devoid of mockery. Elias let out a long sigh. "I knew it," he said. "I knew the moment I couldn't find it. I should have just stayed in bed today." Elias confessed to everything. There was no point in denying it. The evidence was overwhelming. He told Miller about losing his job, about the debts, and about the desperation that had driven him to the bank. Miller listened quietly, taking notes. He had seen it 100 times before. Good people pushed to the brink, making bad decisions. But the law was the law. Bank robbery was a federal crime, and Elias was going to prison. The trial was brief. The defense attorney tried to argue for leniency, citing Elias' clean record and his financial hardship. But the prosecution had the video testimony of the teller, the recovered money, and of course, the wallet found at the crime scene. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Elias Thorne was found guilty of bank robbery and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The judge noted the amateur nature of the crime, but emphasized the seriousness of the offense. The story of the robber who left his ID at the crime scene made the local papers. It was framed as a humorous piece, a light-hearted break from the usual grim news of murders and corruption. Elias became a minor local celebrity for all the wrong reasons. He was dubbed the polite robber by some and the clumsy bandit by others. People laughed at the absurdity of it, shaking their heads at the sheer stupidity of leaving a calling card at a felony. But for Elias Thorne, the laughter was hollow. He spent the next few years in a federal penitentiary, reflecting on the moment his wallet slipped from his pocket. He thought about how a single piece of leather had determined his fate. He realized that crime wasn't just about intent or capability. It was about the chaos of the universe and the unpredictable nature of luck. He had gambled everything on a single roll of the dice, and he had lost in the most spectacular way possible. Upon his release, Elias returned to a world that had moved on without him. The factories were still closed, and the neighborhood was still struggling. But Elias was different. He carried the stigma of a felon, but he also carried a strange sort of wisdom. He lived a quiet life, working odd jobs and staying out of trouble. He never went near a bank again if he could help it. He kept his money in a jar under his bed. The legacy of Elias Thorne is not one of fear or infamy. It is a cautionary tale about the fine line between desperation and disaster. It serves as a reminder that even the best-laid plans can be undone by the simplest of errors. In the annals of true crime, where stories are often filled with blood and darkness, the tale of the dropped ID stands out as a bizarre tragicomedy. It is a story that proves that sometimes the most effective detective on the case is the criminal himself.